I'd like to welcome everybody to our Getting Started with Audio webinar. And just to introduce myself, I'm Alana Baer. I'm Director of the Learning Technologies Lab in the Continuing Professional Development Office in the Faculty of Health Sciences.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick Hoskin. I'm the AV IT Specialist at the LTL and the CPD office.
Excellent. So I'm going to be kicking off the session and then turning it over to Nick, who is going to be teaching you about recording with audio. And before we get going, I just wanted to set out our virtual session guidelines, letting you know that this meeting is being recorded and it will be available for viewing after the session as well and hosted on the Mac PFD website. You can turn your camera on for higher interaction and we will have opportunities for question and answer. I'm recommending that you mute yourself unless you want to speak. At the bottom of the horizontal panel at the bottom of your screen, when you hover over the bottom of your screen, you will see that there's an option to have chat. And so I'm going to ask that you ask any questions during the session into the chat box, and I will help moderate those questions during the session. And following our session, we're going to be sending out a follow-up email with a link to a survey. We want your feedback. We look forward to your takeaways from the session, how well the session went, areas that we can improve, and opportunities for future sessions as well. So our session today is not going to focus so much on the specifics of setting up and doing a recording with a particular software. We're going to focus instead on the more general aspects about how to get started with your audio recording, what type of setup do you need, and looking at some specifics of what can you do at a reasonable price that will give you a good quality recording at the end of the day, where you can record and edit, from spaces to software that you might use, tips and best practices for the recording process and as well as for post-recording, and different sharings along the way. So many of us are using audio for teaching and learning in a variety of different ways. We typically use it when we're in person for our live sessions. We are often, whether we're in person and recording the session for later viewing, or we're online these days recording our session. We might be using audio as part of an online learning module. We might be using it for a podcast or podcast series. There's lots of areas that we are using audio recordings. And one of the most frequent things we hear in the teaching and learning setting on feedback from learners is around the quality of our audio recording. So today's session is really to help you move your audio recordings to the next level, providing as clear recording as possible for your learners and your audience. So one of the things to keep in mind when we're thinking about our audio recordings is that we are also working in a framework of making sure that our education is accessible for our learners. So when we think about our audio, do your best to visually describe a figure, image, or chart with the most pertinent information being described per your interpretation. Set aside a specific time for questions if you are lecturing or presenting live. So in this case, we are doing a live session that is being recorded, and we've set time aside for questions and how we will address those. For live recordings, if questions are asked in a chat section, good practice is to read out that question and answering it in case you've not captured the accompanying video for any reason. And this actually goes a little bit further when you're in a live session. It is good practice if an audience member has asked a question for you to repeat the question because often it's your voice that's being recorded and not those from the audience. And then that question can get captured in the recording. Also, to outline your intended topics and goals for your learners and listeners, and providing your written outline for your recording either beforehand or after the session. And so this is one of the things to keep in mind from an accessibility standpoint, is looking at making our materials more accessible for our learners and audience. We can look at, in its simplest format, our original format, so in this case an audio recording, and adding a +1. So providing that material in one other format. So in this case, in a written transcript or outline for your learners. And that is providing some different ways in which your learners can access that content.
Thank you, Alana. So some common recording questions that we often encounter are where to record. And the best answer for that is to record in a quiet place with minimal noise. I understand that now that everybody's basically at home for the foreseeable future, that's not always an option. But we do recommend finding as quiet a place as possible. During that, you'll be recording on what's called a digital audio workstation, and this is for pure audio. You're also able to edit in these, or in our case, we're recording via Zoom, and we'll be taking the recording afterwards. You can also use products like Camtasia, or even Microsoft has a built-in screen capture. So your essential setup for audio is a microphone, a computer or device, the proper cables that work in conjunction with that microphone, and some software to record and edit. So what to look for before, after, and during recording? The main things you're going to want to look for are to check your input, gain, that you're armed, that's recording to the track that you've chosen, your proof of recording, that can either be a sample recording or it can be just some minor playback in the software, and where you'll be exporting to, as well as the mastered volume. And we'll get into what you need to do to make sure that you're getting as much out of your recording as possible. As I mentioned, you can also edit in a digital audio workstation or a non-linear editor. That's a software like Premiere, Camtasia, and I think Echo 360 might have some editing capabilities, but don't quote me on that. So some of the microphone types. Before I get into that, I want to talk about directionality. So these are the four main types of directions that your microphone will pick up sound from. Some people have omnidirectional mics, which means it's going to capture sound at an equal rate all around the microphone. So whether you're standing behind it, to the left, or in front of it, you're going to capture the same quality and same level of audio, provided your distance is equal. Cardioid mic, that is unidirectional, so you're picking up sound basically just in front of you. And a good practice for that is to leave your mic slightly askew so that you kind of avoid some of the more intense sounds like pops and B's and S's, so they don't sound as jarring. Hypercardioid is the same pattern, only it picks up slightly behind it as well. It's very useful in musical recordings. And bidirectional is basically a cardioid that goes left or right. So while omnidirectional microphones may seem to pick up the most audio, it's best to assess your own recording situation and see what works best for you. So a little bit more info on microphones. We'll start with dynamic microphones. These have great quality capture. They're usually omnidirectional. So dynamic microphones can have cardioid patterns. You need intermediate knowledge to start working with something like this. The example right here is a Shure SM58. This would require an interface as well as an XLR cable to get started. And they're fairly reasonably priced depending on how much you want to invest into your audio quality. Secondly, we have probably the most popular for low studio grade microphones, and that's condenser microphones. They often trade off ease of use for high quality, and it's a much richer tone. There's a classification of microphones that often ranged from cold to hot, and it's fairly simple to evaluate that. When people say a microphone is cold, it picks up low tones much more frequently and to a higher degree. And conversely, with hot microphones, they pick up high tones much more frequently. But they're a little more dangerous to use because the pops fill in at the higher rates. So if you use a hot microphone, you're going to probably have a few more pops and S's in your recording. So it's best to look for a warm microphone. The example we have right here is an Audio-Technica 2020. It's actually what I'm using right now, and that's a warm microphone. So for reference, you can listen to my voice. Just like the dynamic microphones, they also require a little bit extra setup and some peripherals. You need an interface and an XLR cable. And they are probably the highest cost for someone looking at just pure vocal recordings for something like a lecture or a presentation. They are usually in cardioid directionality as well. USB microphones often have minimal setup required. You don't need an XLR cable. You don't need an interface. They're plug and play. They're good to go. And they have a wide range of quality and price available. The rule with microphones is basically however much you want to spend is what you're going to be able to spend. So we're looking at just the most general average entry point microphones, what is accessible to people at a relatively easy price point. They trade off power and sensitivity for convenience as well. That doesn't mean that they're not sensitive and that they don't pick up very good sound quality. They even pick up some of the tone of your voice, called the timbre. In the example here, the blue microphone, This one has adaptable directionality, so you can set if you want it to be unidirectional and simply speak into it, or if you'd rather have a conversational style with multiple people, you can set it to omnidirectional. So lavalier or lapel microphones, they're easy to start. They're omnidirectional in most cases, but the microphone is so small, you're probably not going to be able to get the benefits of it unless you're very close to it. They're considered field microphones, so when you're recording in a portable space without a studio or without a home setup, these are probably what you're going to be using. They have decent frequency pickup, but for the price point, I wouldn't recommend them, and they're extremely mobile. Headset microphones, this will probably be what everybody is opting to choose because they're all in one. You get your monitor, you get your speaker, the cord is usually USB, and they're very flexible and mobile. So you can move back and forth between the mic and you'll be picking up pretty much the exact same sound depending on your volume of voice. They're comparatively decent quality, especially when compared to a lapel mic. They're about the same, but they are attached to the monitors, so they do pick up a more consistent tone, as I mentioned earlier. And they're relatively cheap, but I would make sure to do the proper research that you're looking at a PC headset mic. Some of them are designed for game systems and may not have USB components, or they may not have the proper compatible software, and they're very accessible. So I made up a little microphone comparison chart to kind of give you a visualization of what I think most people will be considering. Down here we have lavalier mics. They can be very cheap, but they're also kind of the lowest quality. Now everything on this list I do recommend if that's the way you choose to go for your utility purposes. The only thing I wouldn't recommend is to use a built-in laptop microphone. They're about the quality of these inline and lavalier mics, but they're not optimized for human speech, and they're really more of a throw-in with the laptop as a selling point, but they're not good enough quality for you to be giving lectures through. I would personally recommend using a condenser mic or a USB mic or headset mic because those are the most accessible aside from the condenser mic, but this is the best quality. Some examples of popular microphones for beginners are the Blue Yeti. You've probably heard this before, but this is the modular USB mic where you can adapt between directional and unidirectional. So this is a Shure MVL lavalier microphone. It's an omnidirectional lapel condenser microphone. So it's highly sensitive for one direction, which will be when you're speaking. The Sennheiser GSP 350 is a nice headset microphone with a USB cord. So all you have to do is plug it into your computer and you're pretty much good to go. You'll also be able to monitor through the headset. And then there's the AT2020 that I mentioned earlier, but this does require a little bit more setup. The one thing that I would like to note for popular microphones is, while they may be on the more premium side, they're the most worth it because they have the most documentation, tutorials, and they're by far the most accessible for everybody. Some other devices you may be considering are pop filters. These are both pop filters. The one on the left, right here, is a pop filter for a USB dynamic microphone, and you simply slip that onto the microphone and you're good to go. And their purpose is to mainly block harsh sounds. In sound lingo, it's called an envelope. When you first speak, the very first instance of your speech is called the attack. And what a pop filter does is it lessens that attack to make things seem less harsh. So as I mentioned with some of the other microphones, you may need an interface, and you will need an XLR cable for microphones that require an interface. Right here, the plug simply goes into here and then into your microphone, and you mount it on a tripod, and you're basically at the same level as you would be if you had just plugged in a USB mic. So for the purposes here, I would recommend maybe skipping this unless you're very confident in your abilities. So unless your mic comes pre-mounted, you're going to need a tripod, unless you plan on holding it the entire time, like at a concert. And sometimes there are additional screens that you'll see. Sometimes you'll see additional screens that act as pop filters, but they're less of a wire mesh like the pop filter, and they're more of a metal mesh. So they tend to just mute your sound instead of giving you that nice rounded edge. The LTL actually offers a few portable vocal booths, and for Omnidirectional mics, this is an essential. If you've already purchased one, you're going to need this. Otherwise, you're going to pick up sound in your immediate environment all around. And using a condenser mic, you're able to kind of optimize your direction of this. So a typical recording process, the major checklist that you're going to want to look through after you've purchased your microphone is that you want to check that your microphone is plugged in. In some cases, if you're using an interface, these microphones require what's called phantom power. And really, it sounds a lot more intense than it is. You're actually just giving some power to the microphone as an individual product. They don't come with batteries, unlike headset microphones. You're going to want to open your software of choice following that. You're going to want to arm or activate your microphone. That could either be checking your microphone to see that the input is there on your computer, or it could be, if you're already in the DAW, adding it to a track and then setting to record to that track. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. You can test for sound using visual cues or playback, and then you're going to get recording. So this is an example of what a Windows input would look like, and that would be in the sound settings. So for this, I'm using a Focusrite USB interface. So the interface is attached via USB, and then I have XLR cables. And you can test your microphone down here where it says troubleshoot. So these are a couple screenshots of Audacity and Camtasia, what the process would look like for adding a track. It would be up in the taskbar, add new, and stereo track. You can have everything set up to record, but you won't be able to record sound if you don't have a track set up, and if you're not set to record to that track. Camtasia has a similar thing where this drop-down menu under microphone on says which microphone you're using, which setup you're using, and whether you want to capture your screen and record like so, or whether you want to capture some video with the camera setting. A few more screenshots of Audacity show these bars would normally be filled if I were speaking into them in a live setting, and an ideal place to record to is about -18, and that leaves you something called headroom, which I'll get into a little bit later. Here's the microphone record button. I have my input set up. I have my speakers here to listen to. And here's the sound wave that I produced from recording. This is an example of a fairly healthy sound wave. As you can see, the ones on the left would probably be me finishing my sentence and speaking a little bit lower. And the beginning would be me starting a new sentence because I've taken that breath, as you can see right here. And when you're editing, I would recommend not taking out breaths. For one, you speak a lot, you breathe a lot. You're going to be doing a lot of that if you have to take that out. And two, if you do edit out anything other than abnormal sounds, it sounds extremely unnatural. So a few key terms before we get into the best practices and then lead into questions would be gain, clipping, frequency, feedback, bleed, and SPL. So this is a simplified diagram I made of gain. And as I mentioned earlier, this would be about where you're recording. This would be about -18 decibels. And for our purposes, this is kind of the ideal spot that you want to record at, because you're leaving something up here called headroom, which identifies how much audio you have left before you begin to clip, as shown in here. It starts to turn yellow up here on the top right. That's when you're getting into dangerous territory. And this blue bar is your nominal peak level. Afterwards, imagine the sound wave comes up past this headroom, which fills your entire vocal area. It goes past this very top section. You get what's called clipping. And that is basically when you speak too much, you're offering too loud of a sound or too loud of an input level that you're losing audio at that point. The best way to think of it is a full cup. Once you get to the very top, that spills out. The water will spill out, the liquid. The same thing goes for sound. You lose that sound. And sometimes the software tries to replace that sound, but you get what's called an artifact. And that artifact is a very granular, kind of low quality sound. The same thing happens when you're recording in something like Zoom. So if you do live interviews, it will optimize your sound so that your very loudest sounds will be normalized to a normal level. But that also means that sometimes they take advantage of that and your regular speaking voice may be lowered. Then you would have to go in and edit manually. And sometimes they'll compress it so that regardless of how you sound offline, you may kind of sound fuzzy or clippy, like you're speaking into an old telephone. So what gain looks like on an interface, if you choose to go that way, I'll be very brief about this because I don't anticipate a lot of people will be choosing this option should they go forward. This is what gain looks like. Generally, the green is ideal. Once you hit red, it's best to test by seeing how far up you can go before you hit red, which is a bright flashing light, and then pull back a little bit. That would be your nominal speaking level, assuming you don't yell or give large gestures or sounds that would kind of lower the or raise the average of your speech. Down here, this 48 volt, that's all you have to do to give your microphone power is press that button and you have phantom power. And here's where you would plug in your headphones to receive the monitor. So that would be when I have headphones on and I'm speaking into a microphone, I can still hear myself despite having closed caps and everything being muted. My microphone is actually playing back to me so that I know how I'm speaking. Again, this is what a normal envelope looks like. As you see on the left, coming up to this, you have what's called an attack. And that's the first instance of you speaking. The lead up could be an S sound and it raises, and then going down, you have you filling out the rest of your speech. And these are all enunciation points that kind of raise and lower. So whatever word is being said here is roughly about 3 or 4 syllables, and you can make that out. A few more additional key terms. I'll go past these because they do kind of fall into best practices, but feedback is pretty important because depending on how you're listening to your sound, you may have your monitors playing back that sound for you to hear unless you've turned it off or you've used headphones, and that sound will feed back into your microphone. And the same thing goes for bleed. It'll just create a loop, and it either creates a really sharp sound or you get a weird echo sound like when you're hearing yourself on speakerphone. So audio frequency, you may see this on microphone stats, product pages. There are signals in the range of human audibility, which is 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And that sounds like a very large range, but most of speaking range is between about 100 and 15,000. The average speaking range is only between 5,000 and 8,000 hertz. So anything past that is a very sharp sound. And really, if you're looking at a microphone, most of them will be between 15 and 15,000 either way. So I mentioned bleed earlier, but that's when multiple microphones play into this, not just one monitor source. So preventing it is as simple as using closed caps or perhaps blocking other directional mics in ways they might pick up audio. And SPL, this is actually an audiologist term, but sound pressure level is how loud a certain decibel can be at certain frequency levels. So if you've ever taken a hearing test and you're listening to a very high-pitched sound, if it goes beyond a certain level, you have to raise the volume to be able to hear it. And they do this to determine hearing loss. But in this case, it's about how far you should be from your microphone to receive the optimal headroom that I mentioned earlier, getting the most out of your sound without losing that quality. So some microphone recording techniques are to keep a consistent distance. And IBM recommends about 4 to 6 inches for condenser and dynamic microphones. I'm about 8 inches, so I may sound a little bit more distant with the decibel input that I'm using, so the gain that I have set. But if you use a headset microphone or a lapel mic, you're going to have to be closer because, for one, your microphone is a little bit worse quality because it's smaller. The pins aren't picking up as much quality, and they're not picking up different intonations. So you may sound a little granular. So keeping your cadence or rhythm natural, it's very hard to do oftentimes, but the best way to do that is to kind of keep to an outline and remember your talking points so you don't meander or mumble. Another thing to note that I think is probably one of the most important things is that your monitoring hardware does not reflect your recording hardware unless you have an inline microphone. So you're using earbud with a little microphone in it, because you may have very high quality headphones and a terrible, terrible microphone. But if you're speaking into it and you're hearing it, the average listener who may be using earphones or earbuds, will not be picking up that sound at the level that you are anyway. So use microphone or headphones to monitor your sound. This is very important so you can avoid things like feedback and bleed. If you use a directional mic, you won't encounter this quite as often as if you use a omnidirectional mic. So as Ilana mentioned, writing transcripts or scripts can be very important. It not only keeps you on topic, but it keeps you keeping your voice natural. It keeps you assertive and making sure that you don't meander or kind of mumble. Giving sufficient pauses to breathe and process your thoughts are also very important. For one, it helps you when you're editing in post, if you do choose to do that. And two, it allows you to collect your thoughts. And as I mentioned earlier, cheap can be good, provided you tend to stay in a quiet room and keep these other recording techniques in mind, because your quality is mostly determined by how much effort you're willing to put in, not much how much you're willing to spend. Even the best microphones can be poorly used, as the cheapest microphones can be exceptionally used. So positioning varies pretty greatly between microphones, especially with different directionalities in mind. It's best to look at the product examples to see where they're speaking into. But one good thing to note is that distance is always important. You should know your directionality, you should know your distance, and you should know where your mic should be set so you get the optimal sound pickup. Some best practices for microphones. If you can, keep an eye on your audio levels. This is pretty important, as if you find yourself clipping a little bit, if you have the opportunity to re-record, that's great. If you don't, you're going to want to lower your input level, especially if it's something more difficult to do, like lowering your speaking voice as opposed to lowering your input level. So clarity of voice, proper enunciation. Depending on what word choice you use, you may have very sharp pops and S's, and that can be unavoided, but it's best to know what you're saying before you say it. Varying your volume. If you want to make a point a little bit more assertively, that's fine. But if you start shouting, you're going to clip, because you set up your gain at the most average of your speaking voice. And if you exceed that, you're going to lose it. If you start to mumble, you won't pick up that sound, and then you'll have to automate or mix if you can do that. And if you can't, you may have to re-record. So if you're not recording live, one best practice that I found is to try and break up your recordings. I try to not exceed 20 to 30 minute sessions. For one, they're easier to edit. Two, they're easier to export. And three, you don't want to lose a 2 to 3 hour recording, especially if it's video or if it's done live. A good practice is to pull back for big breaths, yawns, sneezes, coughs, etc. If you make these harsh noises, they're picked up to a lot greater degree, and they're pretty jarring. A few more practices before we move on are that, as I mentioned earlier, you can record a sample to test your quality, or you could simply play it back. Avoid coughing into the microphone and record in as quiet a setting as possible, also mentioned earlier. Yeah, so let's move on. So things you want to look for when you're done recording is that you've kept fairly consistent levels, and you'll be able to see that on a zoomed out expanse of your sound waves. And if you have sections that are extremely quiet, maybe you're interviewing somebody and you have two different sections of speaking, and the person recording on the other side of the microphone, or the other side of the world for that matter, isn't giving you the levels that you want, you can optimize that in post-production by creating a slice between these sections and raising the amplitude. It doesn't always fix the problem, but when you balance and master it, you should get something that's at least audible. If you clip, it's not the end of the world, but you should know that you can edit certain sections to be less jarring or less sharp. So mastering, if you do this in a digital audio workstation, you have the option to master your recording. And what that means is that's going to determine your overall peak levels. What is the highest point of your speaking volume that you hit? And the best practice for industry standards is -0.4 to -0.06 decibels. Or sorry, it should be -0.6. And that's the industry standard. That leaves you enough headroom to avoid peaking when someone else opens it, but it also makes your voice sound more full, and that you're making your point a little bit more clear. And people respect that when it sounds like the voice is almost at an immediate front, like you're having a real conversation with someone. Some of the types you may see of audio files are MP3, WAV, AAC. These are all Apple and Windows audio types. MP3 is going to be a smaller file, but at the cost of a little bit of quality. And the same thing goes with if you're recording video in conjunction with your audio, you're going to want to look for something like an MP4, which is decent quality, and FLV, which is very high quality. As I mentioned, some of the software you can use are right here. McMaster does have some licenses available. So depending on the software that you do choose to use, you should consider that your software has not only editing capabilities, but it allows you to modify and take a look at what your input settings may be. Some digital audio workstations, the examples that I used are Audacity because it's free indefinitely. It's very accessible. It's fairly easy to edit in. I wouldn't recommend it besides clipping and snipping a few end and intro parts, but it's a fine software. Reaper is free for 60 days, and it's very, very easy to use. It's extremely modular, so depending on how much time you want to put into it, it can be a lifesaver technology. If you've done an interview with somebody and the audio is almost irreparable, there are ways to salvage audio in Reaper using effects or editing or little tricks. And then there's Adobe Audition that comes with the Creative Cloud, which is also a digital audio workstation, but it's not quite as accessible as Reaper, and it's a little bit more on the Audacity level with some spruced up UI. I would still recommend it, however. So Alana, I'm gonna leave some resources and supports for you to discuss before we kind of let into some questions.
Thanks, Nick. And so just to talk about some of the resources and supports for helping you really get started with the audio recordings. We have resources both internally at McMaster University, as well as a variety of resources that are externally available through other services and supports online or in person. And so just as a starting point to get started, we have a number of groups at McMaster that have some role in using technology in the education and research landscape. And so our lab, the Learning Technologies Lab, along with the Program for Faculty Development, are here to support you in your use of audio and other technologies in your educational settings. And today's session was an example of an offering that we can provide, which is, getting started at this introduction into how to get the most out of your audio recordings. But we can take you steps further where we can then teach you how to use a particular software, how to get your setup individualized for yourself. I know that most of us are working remotely right now, but we are able to provide some online remote support. We are also now able to go onto campus and use some of the recording spaces on campus to do recordings. So that is an option as you're moving forward. If you have recordings to do, please contact us and we can help you set that up. Another option is that we do have some of the hardware that Nick was talking about. We do have a microphone and a portable sound booth with a pop filter that can be borrowed from our office and used in your own environment to do recordings as well. And we're happy to facilitate that process. Computer Services Unit in the Faculty of Health Sciences provides a lot of support, especially around the classroom-based technologies, and will be providing a lot of the assistance with in-person recordings back on campus. Same with McPherson Institute. They have a lot of resources available right now, especially around teaching remotely. University Technology Services also offers a lot of training supports, particularly around Zoom and Microsoft Teams. And a site to be aware of and familiar with is McMaster Accessibility Hub, which outlines our requirements for making our education accessible for our learners and our audiences. Just a couple examples of some of the external resources that are available is the TechSmith website has a lot of tutorials on Camtasia to help get you started with Camtasia and be able to do more advanced skills within Camtasia as well. LinkedIn Learning, provided by Linda. We've highlighted one here, the podcast microphone and starting guide to really get you started on using your microphone. Lynda.com at McMaster University, we do have a subscription to this institutional wide so that you are able to access other Lynda.com resources as well. I'm going to open it now for questions and sharing of a couple other tips as we discuss in our questions. So Nick, I'm going to direct some questions to you.
Absolutely.
Do you know the approximate comparative price point of the examples you mentioned for the microphones?
let's see if we can go back to it. Inline mics, I've left them far to the left because you can range inline mics, if you're lucky, they can be about $30. Most headphones range between about $70 to pretty much as much as you want to spend, but they average out, at least you kind of lose out on that quality past $200. It's not really worth it. USB mics. So the average mic price for USB mics, especially the Blue products, is about $200, and then $200 will get you going immediately. All you have to do is plug in and you're good to record. And the same goes for lavalier mics. You're good to record. It might be slightly worse quality, and it's only a little bit more expensive than the 200. The dynamic and the condenser mics, if you want to go for exceptional quality, have great headroom and full control, you're looking at about $400. And the two are fairly similar in price, with my setup being about $400 all told, because cables are maybe $10. The microphone will be, including a tripod, would be about $200, and the interface, if you're lucky, if you get one like the Scarlett Solo, could be about $150. But the problem with this is that because of the pandemic, prices have surged for third-party sellers. So if you can't get it directly from the manufacturer or distributor, non-third party, I would not purchase it.
I would just add on about the microphones in terms of purchasing. Just doing a quick search, some places are starting to predict when they're going to get things back in stock. And so over the next few weeks, you might start to see different microphones being back in stock, different webcams being back in stock. So keep an eye out for that if you are looking for a purchase of a microphone or other recording equipment.
And you can wish list some products. So if you want them to send you an email when they anticipate stock coming back, they can do that as well. But I do recommend, as long as you can find a reputable brand, all of the ones I mentioned here, Shure, Blue, Sennheiser, and Audio-Technica, they're amazing brands. They have so much help tutorial-wise to assist you, and they're always good products. The reviews tend to guide my way when I look at headset microphones, because they're all in one package and you get the ability to monitor and speak. You really can't go wrong if you're just starting.
So I wanted to get a clarification on what you mean when you say, you did make the point with a headset, you can monitor while you record. How's that different from what you can do with the other microphones? Is it because you're directly hearing it through your headset as if your audience would hear it? Is that what you mean by that?
That's exactly what I mean. It's basically going through a single package. You're getting to hear what you're saying and you're getting to say it all at once.
Okay.
So with a condenser mic, as I used as an example, if I took my headphones out, I wouldn't be able to hear anything. And if I didn't have any speakers plugged in, I wouldn't be able to monitor either. I could visually see the sound waves, but I wouldn't know to what degree I'm hearing them and to what quality.
Okay, so that's a real plus for having a headset as opposed to the others from that perspective.
Absolutely, unless you want to go to the more advanced stuff. But I wouldn't recommend it for the purposes of a lecture.
I was going to just follow up on that. So as an amateur as well, I think, for me, a lot of the recording is going to be, okay, we're giving a talk, but the medical students, like the medical school or the residency program is going to want to record it just in case there's a technical glitch. People want to refer back to it. It sounds like for something like that, I think if you're doing a live event as an amateur, I think I'd find it kind of overwhelming to try and monitor my recording as well. I think in most cases, there'd actually be like a third person potentially recording that in situations like that. I think just to clarify, like a lot of what you've been mentioning is like if I was actually preparing a talk, not live, and wanted to add an audio file to a set of slides that I could then make as an online learning module. Is that correct? Yeah.
So like in my case, I'm only able to monitor what I'm saying based on what I can hear. That's how I'm certain, and you two also responding to me makes me certain that I'm producing some sound. In the case of distance learning or perhaps long distance interviews, you can monitor via how much reception you're getting. So if you can hear yourself, if someone can hear you, you're probably getting a decent sound. and they'll be able to tell you whether your voice is jarring or you're giving too much information. But for a live event, yeah, you would probably have a sound engineer or at least somebody to monitor and make sure that the total output is still there. Does that answer
So-
your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
I would just add on to that too, thinking about what's going to be coming up for the fall term that's going to be quickly upon us, that I know many instructors are going to be running live virtual sessions with their students and are going to be teaching from their home space. And so, I mean, right now my setup at home is not ideal. I am using my laptop microphone and we'll be picking up a better microphone because I will be teaching online throughout the fall. And so thinking about also how often you're going to be using that microphone may be worth that investment. So for someone like myself, where I might be on 2 to 4 times a week teaching over the term or the entire year, that might be a worthwhile investment for me to do that. And because I'll be doing it from home, I'm not going to have a sound engineer to help out. So it's trying to set up as best as possible for that recording. That leads into another question. I'm just going to jump ahead one of the questions about where are recording spaces located. So recording spaces have just recently opened up in the Faculty of Health Sciences, in the Health Science Center, and in MDCL. There is a process for booking that recording space, and we can share out that information afterwards. There are also some additional spaces on campus that are available, and there's a central booking system for that as well. So we can get you started with some of those resources. In addition, as I'm thinking about resources, in addition to what we shared today, there is a PDF version of this session with some additional resources and hyperlinks to some of the tools and software that Nick has been mentioning, and we'll be sharing that out as well. The last question that was in the chat was around the tripod for a lavalier. And I know that I've seen little mini tripods for lavalier microphones when somebody has had that. Nick, do you have any comments about that?
There are mini tripods you can buy as well, but generally a tripod is only a means to mount your microphone to make sure that it's not moving too much and you keep a consistent distance. So as long as you can find a way, maybe a clothes hanger, if it's hanging over something and it's stable, anything you can actually get to stabilize and keep that microphone consistent would work.
Yeah, when I was asking that question, I was thinking of it, because it's the same one as the lapel, right? You can put it in a lapel.
Yep.
So I was thinking if you pin it to yourself, mind you, I suppose you can get a lot of extraneous noise from you moving. So it's probably not a good idea, actually.
A little bit, not as much as you would think. Unless you're constantly ruffling your shirt, you should be able to just kind of pin it to your collar and you'd be good to go.
So that was why I was thinking perhaps you would need it. And would that also, if you bought a lavalier, would it also could be used for when you're giving live lectures? Like that could.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's the other advantage. I guess it depends on what various uses that you might foresee it beyond just recording in a static sense.
Another little trick that's an at-home option to make for those pop filters. They're usually, I think, around $20 to buy one, but it's mostly looks like a nylon mesh. So if you have a nylon stocking and you take, a round circle of something, it might even just take a wire hanger and mold it into a circle shape and put the nylon stocking over that, that could act as an at-home pop filter for yourself as well.
Sounds like a good hack.
Well, most of us are at home and some supplies might be limited. So thinking of creative ways to help get everybody going.
I was thinking you could do that with the foam too. To put foam, like a line of foam blocks, or if you were going to use one of those condenser mics or whatnot.
Yeah.
Right. And so we have that as a resource. We have a portable sound booth, which is lined with acoustic foam. So exactly to your point. And then we put our microphone in that to help block out additional sounds. So I'm going to bring us to the close of our session today. Thank you very much for your participation. We are going to be sharing with you, as I mentioned earlier, some additional resources following the session. The session is going to be put up on the MAC PFD site as well, so you can refer back to it. and we are happy to help you with whatever you need to get you to the next steps of your audio recording ventures. So thank you very much for your time and attention today.